Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our federal spending series. My name is Nikita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the federal spending coordinator for this project. I'm a community organizer, arts and culture worker, and we are partnering with Rainier Beach Action Coalition and community artists, educators, community organizers to develop a toolkit to help our communities, especially Black and Brown and other marginalized communities, know how to organize around federal investments to make sure our communities get the support that we need. This is a part of a larger series, including a series of workshops that will start on August 27th. Be looking out for promotional materials about how you can join with Sean Glaze from Inclusive Data, who's a part of today's panel to learn more about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, say that 3 times fast, and how you can be organizing in your community to push the right buttons to make sure that our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities receive the infrastructure that they need. I'm really excited for today's panel where we're going to talk about infrastructure for the people and thinking about what kind of infrastructure is most needed, especially in our communities that are most economically disenfranchised. What does that infrastructure look like? How can IIJA be a part of making sure that infrastructure starts to exist? What are the limitations of the current federal act? And what can we be doing at our local level to ensure that our communities have the infrastructure we need? So I want to introduce you to our illustrious panel, who's actually going to introduce themselves. I'm going to let them pop up on screen. There we are. Hello, our wonderful IIJA panel. I'm so excited to have each of you who have different spaces of expertise to really help bring together this educational 80 to 90 minutes where we're learning about this new federal spending package. So my question for you is, who are you? How do you introduce yourself? And why is this conversation important to you, both personally and professionally? I'm just going to hop right in there with Sean.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. I am Sean Glaze. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Chief Consulting Officer for Inclusive Data. We're the team that's gotten well over 18 million in 18 months in grants for Black communities, and I am stoked to be here today because a big part of what we love to do is provide free resources, free training, free education to our communities so that they can learn how to get what they need to thrive. So I'm really excited about that. This conversation is important to me because these huge investments, a lot of times our communities count themselves out because they don't think it's going to reach them or doesn't apply. That's because they speak like a different language. And so I'm really excited today to be talking about how do we get these federal money, this funding into our community and really create the world we want to see. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to be here with the other panelists as well.
Oh, mute button. You would think by now in this digital age, I would know to mute myself, but thank you for the signs from the gallery. I'm going to pass it to Commissioner Hasegawa.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Toshiko Hasegawa. I am a newly elected Port of Seattle Commissioner, but today I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm going to stack on top also my role as Executive Director of Washington State's Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. And I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really grateful to be invited to be able to share some perspective with everyone today and some of the experience that I've been able to gain in my short but intense time at the port. This conversation is really important because the Port of Seattle specifically is widely considered to be the economic engine of our entire region. It touches a bunch of jobs. It touches contract opportunities for businesses, but it's also one of the top polluters in the state. It has both aviation and maritime in its portfolio. And a lot of the IIJA funding actually goes directly to folks who have stewardship over airports, which of course means us. So we have a really important role to play to make sure some of that access, those economic opportunities, is going to go into the hands of POC and women and non-binary workers, as well as businesses, But we also have to take the 100,000-foot view to make sure that some of the plans that we're putting into action now are going to translate into overall health of our communities, of our environment. We're talking about the way we're going to transform the way we operate as a nation. It has everything to do with an environmental justice conversation, which has direct impacts upon community health and quality of life. From the CAPA perspective, we had a lot of lessons learned during the pandemic about inaccess to grant opportunities. So let's take those lessons learned and apply them here. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and really excited to hear environmental and climate justice already entering the conversation. I think that's an important intersection of infrastructure. I want to pass it to Senator Nguyen.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. I'm Senator Joe Nguyen here in the 34th Legislative District. It's White Center, West Seattle, Vashon Island. It also includes the entire port now, and I also have Soto, Georgetown, Highland Park, and parts of downtown as well. And this is such an important conversation for us, specifically here locally, because when you look at investments in infrastructure, oftentimes our communities are told after the fact when decisions are made. And you've seen that manifest not just locally here in Seattle, but across the nation as well. I think one of the most important things when we talk about the IIJA is also, in addition to getting access to infrastructure and funding, is how do we implement it equitably with the community in mind? We're seeing the impacts of that now in the International District as well. So my goal as someone who serves on the Transportation Committee, as someone who helps negotiate the projects that will be implemented, is to ensure that we're doing it in a way that's mindful of our communities as well. And that's why I'm excited about this, because we do need a lot of investments in our communities, but we also need to be doing it in a way that addresses the historical harms, but also being mindful of those who live there now.
Thank you so much, Senator Nguyen. And equitable investments are definitely going to be a part of this conversation. What does implementation look like? And last but not least, one of my favorite people, Kirsten Harris-Talley.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in this conversation with neighbors. I'm Kirsten Harris-Talley, she, her. I am a community organizer and community healer. Me and my business partner have an organization in the works where we do anti-racism work. And while healing work is often work of community, it is also work of healing systems that have done harm. And for me, I'm also an elected official. I serve as state representative for the 37th district. I'm serving until January. And that has given me the opportunity to see how our state budget comes together and what that means in a state like Washington State that has the most upside down in the country, the absolute worst, most inequitable tax code in the country, and also a state where we have the world's largest corporations and some of the largest concentrations of wealth in the country. And yet we have deep, deep, deep inequities when you look at race, ethnicity, class, and gender. So just because resources are near us in proximity does not mean that the resources that are the people's resources, our tax dollars, are being invested into the parts of the community that deserve those resources. So I'm very excited to talk a bit about how those systems work, how community has shown up and advocated, and how we're changing these systems to be responsive in real time to community needs.
Thank you so much. Already hopping into the meat and potatoes of this conversation, or whatever you consider to be real sustenance. I don't really eat meat, so there that is. I want us to first figure out how we can talk about what the Infrastructure Investments and Job Act is. And so I'm going to ask each of you, in your own words, from your perspective and the work that you do, what is IIJA as if you were explaining it to a 7th grader? You got that last part? Like you're talking to a 7th grader. I'm actually going to throw it right back to Kirsten Harris-Talley.
Yeah, so in essence, these are, the ways that resources can be invested back, but these are investments in infrastructure. And what we mean by infrastructure when we're talking about government dollars and flow is built environments, spaces where we convene, spaces where we congregate, spaces that are public and communal. And these are really, really, really important investments when you're talking about a democracy, because a democracy is supposed to be about everyone having access to the same things, and actually those who have the least getting as much access as they need for equity. So it's an interesting time that we're having those conversations, to me, on the back of a global pandemic and a concentration of that pandemic in our local communities. So we have this rub of some of the most tense times where folks have been most separated, being also the time that we're thinking about what are these investments into our collective. So it's a very interesting time for the conversations.
Thank you, Kirsten. I have to like really push myself not to say your full name. It's like a whole magical name. Joe, how would you explain IIJA
Yeah.
to a seventh grader?
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly important package by the federal government. So it's over $1 trillion. So over $1 trillion that will be spent throughout the United States and within our communities as well. So if you care about things like access to internet, if you need clean water, if you use our roads, our bridges, or even if you consume goods that use our roads and bridges and rails, this is an incredibly important investment that we can make in our communities. Because for too long, we've underinvested in these basic things, especially in communities that have needed the most. And this is finally an investment that's not necessarily the Green New Deal, but it's certainly an investment that will be transformative for a lot of people as well. So it's important that as we're making these investments for our future, folks, especially if you're in middle or high school, you're the ones that are going to be impacted by this the most. So you should be engaged within this process as well. So if you care about roads, if you care about water, if you care about the internet, hopefully we can help engage to ensure that the investments are done in a way that makes sense to you too.
Thank you. I love that. I mean, that's true because this infrastructure is not going to get built overnight. We know how long it takes for federal dollars to get dispersed and then implemented. So what's happening right now really is going to be deeply impacting. It's going to impact all of our lives, but young people in middle school, they're the ones that will inherit how well we do or don't do this.
Exactly.
Toshiko.
The way I would describe the IIJA is it is a $1.2 trillion investment by the federal government, trillion with a T, that was passed by both Democrats and Republicans. That means both sides of the aisle agreed that we needed to put big money into updating our infrastructure, which are things that just make life livable every single day for all people. I'm talking about our roads, our freeways, our bridges, our buildings, but it's also the things underground that make it so important for us to be able to live our lives, like our energy grid. It's our water systems. It's our broadband and internet. So when we feel like some of these systems are failing, we feel that in a very, very real, debilitating way. And not everybody has had equitable access to new infrastructure. And the other thing is that our energy grid, widely, the United States and right here at home, we still live squarely in a fossil fuel paradigm. It means we're dependent upon these kinds of energy and fuels that actually make our climate crisis worse. So when we're talking about $1.2 trillion investing into our infrastructure, what we're talking about is also additionally $370 billion of that money going directly into climate provisions. That looks like being able to invest in renewable green energy sources. And it's really an opportunity also for us to emerge different industries. So updating our infrastructure translates directly into jobs to build that new infrastructure, which has to be managed by businesses that manage those projects. And it also means opportunities for communities themselves to be able to apply. And it is noteworthy that there's $60 billion vision specifically. That's big money, and it's big money for long-term results. So this is the place where we get really excited as some of these decision makers in the room about how we're going to apply for these funds, and if we get them, what we're going to do with them. Because this is such big money that it's an opportunity to end generational cycles of poverty. It's an opportunity to get people into good wage, family wage jobs. It's an opportunity to be able to lift historically excluded neighborhoods out of depression, and make sure that they're also being fairly invested in. So we think about all of these things together when we're thinking about infrastructure. It's not just about roads, it's also about our climate and our community health, which is why this is so exciting.
I feel like you should make the commercial for IIJA, and we can put it on a bus, run it on the internet. I love that you're uplifting the jobs and economic investments, because there will be a lot of money flowing through. The question is, do the folks who need access to it get access to it? And so I'm really excited to have Sean on with us. Sean, as a researcher, educator, community organizer, how would you explain IIJA to a 7th grader?
Awesome. Thank you. I love this question. The first thing that I would do is try to really put the money in context. So when we think about what $1 trillion means, if you spent $1 a second, it would take you 32,000 years to get to $1 trillion, and this is more money than that. So what I'm saying is, like, this is over 3,000 generations that could be affected if you spend $1 a second. That's a lot of money. What's really cool is government money, which means that we, the people, have the ability to influence it. So that means that no matter if you are someone who's like, I'm going to vote or not vote, whatever you decide, you have something to say about this. They need to hear what you got to say about this. The second thing that I like to tell people is the IIJA, this funding we're talking about today, the acronym I keep in my head is BUILT. And it stands for something, because people keep saying this money's for the built environment, building infrastructure. BUILT, the B stands for blue, for water, right? For bridges, for thinking about how do we get that blue climate, just like that blue beat, built, right? The U, that's for union, good paying jobs. So we're talking about making sure that our community can work, making sure that we can have our needs met, making sure that these are good workplaces that aren't just paying good money, but also looking out for each other. The I in BUILT stands for internet and also infrastructure. So when people hear infrastructure, they think roads and highways and things like that. But it's also internet, being able to connect with each other, being able to, make sure that we can talk and access conversations like this where we learn how to get into that money. The L, I like to say it stands for electric, like electricity, the energy grid, right? Making sure that we are able to get power into our houses, into places that need that electricity. I'm from Texas. I can tell you the electricity grid's particularly important to figure out so that we're not all out in the cold. And the T is for transit. It is for trains. It is for making sure that our transportation system's working. So all that said, we're talking about one of those big buckets of money that you can help influence. And that's why I'm so excited for this conversation today.
Sean came through with the acronym, y'all. They were so ready. Educators, I love you. I love you. Thank you for those answers. In this next session, I really want to dig into what could IIJA mean for some of our most vulnerable, marginalized, and historically, and I'd say presently excluded communities. And I would like for each of you to kind of take your own angle. I've heard Toshiko already talk about climate justice. Kirsten, I heard you already start to lift up how these dollars can either exacerbate an issue or they can address inequities. Joe, I heard you bring up implementation and what does that look like? And Sean, you're always going to teach us how to get the money. So I would love to hear from each of you from the areas that you've already started to highlight. What does this mean for especially our Black, Brown, Indigenous communities? And what are ways that we need not just elected officials, but even our community organizers, our various stakeholders to be thinking about how we engage in the local process? And part of that might be in your answer is also explaining what the heck is the local process? It's a little confusing. So Toshiko, I'm gonna have you jump in first. I might bring you back in more later, just so you all know. I might hear a follow-up and be like, what do you think about that, Joe? So I'm giving you informed consent. Toshiko, what does this mean for our communities? Working on the mute button.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Well, so there's a lot of different things happening in tandem. There's the IIJA, but also recently the Biden administration announced $350 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. They could have named that act anything. They called it inflation reduction. They must have taken a poll. But it is also a really robust climate action package, which means additional funds available to be able to address environmental injustice. From my perspective at the Port of Seattle, that looks like opportunities for us to get to invest into programs that are going to both directly and indirectly benefit our communities. By indirectly, I mean we can address some of our own issues as polluters to be able to make sure that we are transforming our fleet, both on land and at sea, that our community members are complaining are polluting their quality of life, their adjacent neighborhoods. We know because of the history of redlining that communities of color and working families are clustered around transportation hubs. This is all so important because they're the ones who are going to feel the impacts of climate change first. They're the ones who are going to feel the very real measurable disparate outcomes in health and infant mortality, higher incidence of asthma and cancer. And all of this relates directly back to infrastructure. And so we really want to be mindful at the port and how we're investing and making sure that we're transforming our facilities, getting them off of fossil fuels and getting them towards renewable resources. And we think about also how we can plug into a supply chain that will make some of these renewable energies exportable and consumable by other places too. So we're not just lifting ourselves up, but we're actually transforming the way the world is operating. So there's really exciting conversations about hydrogen. I say these buzzwords, these super niche industrial terms, because communities need to be thinking about them, because this is where the money's going. You need to get familiar. The writing is on the wall that with new infrastructure, it means new ways of running our country. It means new, cleaner energy. So big corporations like Shell, for example, are already hip to it. That's going to be their new hustle. We need to make sure that we have a diverse and thriving economy, because a diverse economy is a resilient economy. And that's also how we're going to make sure that people who have not historically had access to capital are going to have access to this capital, to these emerging industries that we're making serious investments into supporting right now. Some of the direct ways that we're going to try and be investing in communities also is creating our own grant programs, creating our own programs that are going to help businesses to be able to apply for money opportunities. Folks, I encourage you to write in to my port email, and we'd be happy to direct you so that businesses themselves have access to some of that support that they need in order to contend in a competitive market. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier is that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for community-based organizations themselves to apply also for these monies. And so we're investing in a program also that will make sure that we're going to be able to help facilitate folks to be able to contend in actually transforming their own communities with projects that serve directly community health and environmental justice. So there's so many different ways the money is going to be moving. And we all have to be really mindful about how we're going to be able to access some of those opportunities and connect them directly with communities, whether they're workers, businesses, or community-based organizations.
Do you mind if I just ask you a follow-up about like areas like Beacon Hill or South Park or Georgetown, where, you know, roads are not great. There's a lot of port transportation going through. There's the King County International Airport. do you see areas in which, and those are heavily Black and brown neighborhoods. What ways do you see that IIJA could be useful, things we could apply for, places that specifically for communities that are experiencing pollution, and they don't necessarily have control over the factors? Like, we don't control airplanes flying over us. We don't control, the trucks that are driving through Georgetown. How might IIJA be an opportunity to decrease those polluters and also still recognize that, like, the port is a huge economic driver in our region?
The primary culprit of air pollution from the Port of Seattle is from not us directly, but from our partners, i.e. the airlines. It is from airplanes that are using carbon fuels, and they're dropping on top of our heads, especially those who live next to the airport in South King County and places like SeaTac, Burien, Des Moines, or those who live along the flight path, places like Georgetown, Beacon Hill, even Vashon. And then the other community that's really heavily impacted on the maritime side from carbon emissions from big shipping containers that are sitting in our marina and not turning off, that pollute the communities nearby. Cruise ships, which are tiny cities on the sea that may plug in while they're there, but they're still dumping dirty water and burning carbon fuels at sea. These are all areas where we need to what we call decarbonize. The IIJA and as well as the IRA both set aside money to decarbonize these industries, aviation and maritime. That looks like changing our fuel source away from carbon fuels to what we call sustainable aviation fuels. And we at the port want to make sure that we are working with our partners to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do to be able to embrace that new technology, to make sure that they're embracing sustainable aviation fuels and doing a blend of at least 10%. We're not there yet. We want to see them use at least 10%. That doesn't make a difference for noise impact, right? That's a separate but related conversation. But for those carbon fuels and carbon emissions that hurt us, we can see them transform the way they operate. The same thing with our vessels at sea. We want to see them get off of carbon fuels as soon as possible. When we're talking about our roads, we're talking about trucks coming through. We're talking about trains. We need to think big about how we're going to connect our region so that they have something separate. They don't have to take a plane to get to California. You could hop on a train in Seattle and get down there in less than 24 hours that it would take you to drive to San Diego. That's what we're talking about. We need to reimagine the way we are moving people throughout our region, because that's going to have a tremendous impact on the way that we are having a carbon footprint and having our quality of life. Trucks. What are we doing to expect trucks to transform as well? Right, this is the Pacific Coast and the time of the Pacific. Container operations are going to grow here. We're the premier port in the Pacific Northwest. But these trucks that are taking things from the boats and into the places that are buying them, yes, we need that. And how do we ask that those trucks are going to be reaching their own decarbonization goals? And that's part of the IRA too. Those trucks are oftentimes independent contractors. So now we're talking about businesses, small businesses. These trucks are usually immigrant, refugee, and Black. We're talking about racial justice when we're asking them to transform. How do we make sure it's not at the expense of them able to feed their families? We have a role as a local jurisdiction to make sure that justice, equity is happening in that way, that we're supporting them. So now we're talking about programs that are going to help them make a just transition. We're talking about jobs in these huge buildings that are going up in our area, that these buildings are huge polluters of carbon emissions too, but they're also jobs. This isn't, these don't need to be pitted against each other. We have opportunities to make sure that folks are having jobs and new buildings are not going to be bringing harm to us, killing us softly. And so it's not all just about what we're doing. It's also about how we're doing it. It's going to make the biggest difference in the lives of the communities we represent.
Thanks, Toshiko. So on that note, all the communities that you just named, I feel like we know that funding comes with a lot of challenges, and it can either exacerbate the pre-existing conditions of inequity and oppression, or it can start to address those inequities. Kirsten, when we think about IIJA, what are some of the spaces you see for potential exacerbation, or where do you see an opportunity to address those inequities?
It's an important question, and it's an important question because we're talking about government investment. I think one of the most readily available examples that any pundit or anyone sort of talking about these investments is going to is the New Deal. So the New Deal was one of the largest, deepest investments that we've ever had in our infrastructure as a country. It came on the heels of disaster. Let me be clear. Our country made the disaster. It came after war. It came after a lot of racial reckoning on our own soil. And those investments were deep. There is not a community in the United States that you cannot see directly the impact of the New Deal. It was an investment that lasted almost 35 years from inception to the last dollar being spent. It is in its making structurally what has changed our federal democracy in ways we can't even imagine. Most people don't know we did not always have 9 justices. That changed so that we could pass the New Deal when FDR was president. So these are very large considerations, but the way government implements will make or break the ability to use these dollars as healing dollars in our communities. Because when I talk about the New Deal, let me tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about racial equity because Black, Brown, and Indigenous people were excluded from access to those government dollars. I'm not going to talk about housing equity because spaces like the 37th, where I represent as a state representative, are areas that were redlined. Redlining was invented at the same time that those federal dollars were going out to make sure that Black, Brown, Indigenous, Jewish, and other people who were considered other and undesirable, who were not white, Christian, hetero people, were excluded from access to dollars for housing infrastructure, for jobs and business infrastructure. There was a lot of coming home from war incentives that were given to GIs with the exclusion of if you were brown, Black, Indigenous, or Jewish, or Catholic, non-Christian. So we have had government many a time. That's one of many stories I can tell you of huge amounts of investment that happened. But we don't have to go all the way back to the 1930s and 40s to see that example. We need only go back 2 years ago when we had the largest investment in small businesses this country has ever seen with our PPE investments and other investments with COVID. And we saw 98% of Black, Brown, and Indigenous businesses that applied for those dollars get rejected before their application had even been reviewed. The government, the federal government right now, under this administration, currently is denying Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities resources. And the way that federal resources come through is one of 2 ways. Either the federal government will directly grant out to communities, so you would apply directly to divisions under the federal government for dollars, or the state itself will make that inquiry and get a grant, and then the state will administer a grants program. And that grants program will then be administered to counties and cities. And only after the feds have given the state their money and the state has made their decisions and gotten their cut and given it to counties, who then have gone through their administration and taken their cut and given it to cities, will community even know that the dollars are available. But here's what I need you to know. Every piece of how that's administered happens in public committees, task forces, committees that make decisions, rules that are made about how grants happen from the federal level. And that's the place of influence that we need to have if we want to make sure that the most marginalized and ignored communities are not the ones, again, left in the cold. And I say that because with the previous federal administration, and even with a really solid infrastructure, for years we've been in a state where our elected officials have decided to take dollars and invest it in community because of the political infrastructure of our state. Me and my colleagues just in the last 2 years have made huge investments and changes at the state level. What the commissioner was talking about alternative fuels, we can apply as Washington State for those dollars from the federal level because 2 years ago, me and my colleagues passed a clean fuel standard, which means we now said it's legal in Washington State to explore non-fossil fuels development, build refineries here, actually have access to non-fossil fuel options. So those kind of decisions that have been made on the state level are now going to influence our state's ability to apply for those types of dollars when the feds bring those dollars out. So my big thing for community right now, I know it's hard, and I know it's the part of democracy that's not the most fun part, sitting while we drone on for hours in committee, but those are the places where equity will or will not be folded into the implementation of these dollars. And that's the place where we need to have pressure on our influencers and decision makers so that when the dollars do reach our communities, we know they'll say yes when we apply.
Do you have any recommendations? I see Sean clapping. Sean's like, yes. Do you have any recommendations for folks who live in states, organizers that are living in states that maybe have not done the work that Washington has already done around like some of the infrastructure ability to apply for certain things? What would you recommend to those organizers?
So the way that I've been most aware, particularly when it comes to environmental justice values system or participatory budgeting, right? So community voice and budgeting processes, those things, find at the local level where your political home is for whatever the issue you care about is. And I'm telling you right now, whatever issue you care about, these dollars are going there. If what you're thinking in your mind is, I care about babies being born and being healthy, the amount of money that is going to be invested in hospital infrastructure, probably in the community you're in, with these dollars, find the political home that's going to advocate for those dollars to go to community-based healthcare, right? So those are the places I always look for. In Washington state, my political homes have been places like Surge Northwest, which is a reproductive justice-based organization. Black, brown, queer, indigenous folks who, right, are really looking for those solutions. They're usually 501c3, which means they first over profit and other things is the thing that motivates them. Those are the places to find out what's possible in your state and make sure your voice gets amplified with neighbors' voices and gets heard. So there's tons of organizations like that at your state. Really just reaching out, sometimes just doing a Google search, blah, 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 justice, policing justice, healthcare justice, and your state will pop up with a number of organizations that you can start calling and vetting. And ask your friends and neighbors where they consider their political homes. People who your values align with, they probably have spaces they're gathering you don't know about till you ask.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And while we're thinking about some of these implementation pieces, like I love that you brought in history. Like the New Deal was such a devastating piece. Like it could have been an opportunity to turn things around, and instead, because we allowed the ways in which our oppressive institutions have worked since the inception of this country to make the decision around implementation and who had access, we just deepened the wounds. And so I really appreciate you bringing that into this context, because sometimes I think we forget that those things are still happening and they're still determining how money and resources are being allocated and implemented. Joe, you know, working at the state level, I feel like you've actually done quite a bit of work around infrastructure in your tenure. What do you recommend folks be thinking about around implementation? What do you see the hurdles are? And weaving in some of what we heard Toshiko and Kirsten talk about, can you like provide some thoughts, some pointers?
Yeah, here, I'll take it a little bit more high level. First off, because both my colleagues did such a tremendous job explaining this as well. But systems of power tend to reflect the people who created them, right? And as of until the last 4 years, Washington State did not reflect the diversity of the folks who live here as well. And a lot of the bills that have passed that Rep. Harris-Talley just mentioned were because of the most diverse legislature in the history of Washington State, prioritizing things that were important for our communities. And that word prioritization is very important, because if you look at Washington State as a whole, you know, we see about 2,000 or 3,000 bills in any given year, 2,000 or 3,000 bills. Yet we only pass about 200 to 300, so less than 10%. So all of these historical harms, all of this neglect, all of this funding that went elsewhere, I think if you talk to the folks who did it, they probably wouldn't admit that it was necessarily on purpose or necessarily to harm certain individuals or in certain communities, which I think it actually does. It's more of a prioritization. So you have to make sure that your issue is worthy of being discussed. That's the most important thing about politics. That's the most important thing about these investments, is making sure that your issues are worthy of being discussed, that your projects are worthy of being funded, that your communities are worthy of being saved as well, or at the very least supported. So in terms of a lot of the infrastructure work that at least we've done in Washington State, everything from transit for youth, from the investments into multimodal, it is because you have people who are now in office that care about these things. And I say that is because if you are nervous about reaching out, if you are nervous about attending these meetings, just know that there are people there who actively want to have your advice, want to have your opinion, even if they may not necessarily know how to go about doing that just yet. So when we talk about these investments, you've heard it from both my colleagues on this panel, is that a lot of it is from existing programs of the federal government, which is in itself a process, but it also goes through the state as well. So on the very local level, I know that on the transportation side of things, we talked through what that 16-year investment from the IIJA could look like. And the funding that we've already allocated for it is nominal compared to what is available out there as well. And a lot of it was for decarbonization and for preservation as well. So there's a whole host of ways that you can get involved in this process. For as intense as you want to lead these conversations, to even just hey, I think the sidewalks on my roads aren't safe, or we can have traffic calming alternatives here as well. If there are things that you see are important, being able to be proactive, reaching out to your legislators, talking to folks in your community, those are very effective ways to raising the issue. And as context, candidly, I'm relatively new to the political scene. I only got involved about 4 years ago in elected office, but I had been an advocate in the community for a while, which is why I know some of the folks on this call. You are more powerful than you realize, especially in an area like this, where folks want to uplift voices of those who've been harmed in the past. So that's one piece of advice that I would give as we kind of approach this puzzle of how do you solve for investments in infrastructure in a way that's thoughtful, that is equitable, that is lasting as well.
And Joe, just throw it back to you. Where do you see some of the most needed investments are in Washington State, and how could folks be pushing on our electeds to actively be pursuing those investments?
Yeah, me personally, I think multimodal and public transit are some of the biggest ways that we can alleviate the issues that we're facing. So what's interesting is my district includes the port and includes the Duwamish, which has as folks know, is a Superfund site. And one of the biggest ways to address some of the harms, and even myself, I live near a highway in Burien. And I grew up with asthma. I had no idea it was because I was living next to a highway that was an industrial zone, right? So one of the biggest things that we're doing is electrifying the shore power, to ensuring that when these ships come in, they're plugging in using clean energy and not spewing diesel. Even working with our independent drivers to hopefully transition to zero emissions drayage truck, so that way they're not just spewing diesel all over the place as well. So for folks in the community who are looking to get involved, where we can make some of these investments, it's candidly, if you like for Vashon in my district, broadband is a big issue as well. Infrastructure is a big issue, right? So ways to get involved are candidly, if you see a systemic issue within your community, whether it's the roads, whether it's the broadband, whether it's just dirty air, plug into your local elected officials. There are certainly a number, Rep. Harris-Talley mentioned, ways to find community groups or organizations that might be able to help as well. But for me, generally speaking, South King County has been neglected, making sure that we have public investments in infrastructure in places like White Center and South Park, where we've seen historical harm. We've seen highways cut through neighborhoods, and making sure that we're able to either reunify them or even potentially shift those routes, so that the way we can reunify the neighborhoods as well. There's a whole host of things that we can be going after right now with these funding amounts to address the historical harms.
Thank you so much. I really feel like folks are leading into each other. Sean, okay, so I was reading this act, and while I am a lawyer, I definitely don't understand everything. But one thing that came through for me was, I'm not sure they're defining infrastructure the way that I'm defining infrastructure or the needs of infrastructure. Can you, break down a little further for us how infrastructure is being seen? I really appreciate Commissioner Hasagawa for, also illuminating for us the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that's a whole nother piece that we can be thinking about. And ideally this toolkit would help people know how to organize around that. But what are our opportunities here? Where might we need to push people? And for communities who, to be quite frank, either don't like bureaucracy, are uncomfortable with bureaucracy, don't believe bureaucracy works for us, what should we be doing?
Absolutely. So I love this question. I think about it every day. So we're going to start with the first part, which is just like, what does infrastructure even mean? I know that for a lot of us, when we think about infrastructure, first of all, a lot of us don't think about infrastructure. You know, like no one wakes up and thinks, I'm going to think about infrastructure today. But as we navigate the world around us, we are encountering it all the time. So easy things that a lot of people you're going to hear talking about this money are going to be talking about, again, built, right? Bridges, you know, that blue, you know, water. So that's like getting water from wherever it's at into your house. That's infrastructure. You're going to hear people talk about it in terms of climate. So again, blue climate, that clear, clean water, clear, clean air. You're also going to hear people talking about it in terms of, again, those union jobs. So what's interesting about this investment is that when people say infrastructure, they're thinking about hard things, you know, like roads, something you can knock on. But they're also thinking about things like electricity and internet and things that just kind of flow through to wherever you're at, your homes, your libraries, your schools, et cetera. And what all of that means is that now we're thinking about infrastructure, not just in terms of the things, but also like the people who create it, the workers, the folks who are out there making this stuff happen. But there are other things that we care about. When I talk to people all across the country, so outside of Washington, inside Washington, about what their priorities are, they're saying things like, Sean, like we need like buildings, like we need space to be. Sean, we need to make sure that there's like mental health that is being taken care of, that we have well-being. We need access to economic development. We need access to the ability to really just like create the world we know needs to be here. And while many of us have that expansive idea about infrastructure, everything it takes to create that, these investments, like the only way that these investments can be used for stuff like that is if people like us, yes, you watching and your crew, like really make the case to the people who are deciding. Kirsten Harris-Talley, who I also feel like your name is just like one name in my head, hit on something that is like really important, which is that these decisions, the important decisions that'll get made, are going to get made in these task force, work groups, advisory councils. And what I've realized is like a lot of us, we just don't know the key words. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of us, if you just told us the key words, like what exactly to say, like where to go, like we're happy to do it. But if it's going to be a whole new homework assignment of like fixing like this massive, you know, problem, a lot of us just feel like we don't have the time to be able to do it. And so what I would like to share with y'all is a couple of keywords that can really help you as you're like directing these investments. Because a lot of times when we are thinking about these dollars, again, we think about it's for someone else, but it's like, it's for us. It's for us to figure out and for us to be communicating and getting people who work for us to actually work for us. So I'm not an elected official. I will never aspire to be one. Because it's a hard job, but also because like you are suddenly going to work for everybody who's talking to you. Our communities who are passionate about creating that caring infrastructure, that healing infrastructure, that makes sure that our community has what they need. Like we need to know like how to get those folks who work for us to actually like move these dollars where they need to go. So with that said, if you have a pen and paper, or if you're watching this replay, if you're making social media posts, I want you to like comment and know that these are the key things that I want all of us to know to help guide these investments. I want us all to know that when we're talking to these elected officials, which some of y'all like, who, right? Whether that's your mayor, whether that's your city manager, whether that's your state rep, your local rep, your county rep, the people who write rules, your councils, anything that you had to vote for ever or was told to vote for ever, like making sure you know those folks are really going to be able to say what they need to say to get these dollars where they need to go. For them, they know words like public engagement, right? Public engagement, like making sure that the community has been consulted. But here's the trick. we don't just want to be consulted, right? We don't want somebody to say, "What do you think about this?" Like, we want to be directing where these things need to go. So we need to be talking about, hey, my understanding is that there have been trillions of dollars out here and that there's still money at play. Who are the ones who are actually engaging with community directly to decide what eligibility criteria look like? Eligibility criteria. Who are the ones who are going to be deciding what kind of priorities we have? Like, tell me, like, who are the actual regular people who will be helping to decide what this looks like? Because the good thing about government investments is, like, at some level, you will have a process where people will be deciding what that looks like. And some of the rules are set in stone, but actually very few. I'll give you a concrete example. States, like, a lot of the money that's going to come out through this IIJA is going to happen through like whatever formula they used before to disperse. The bad news of that is that these formulas don't usually prioritize our communities. And by our communities, I mean the communities have been consistently underinvested in, skipped over, neglected, right? When it comes to these funding. We already talked about why. If you're watching the video, like, we've already talked about why. Here's the good news though. It's like, even though like these formulas that aren't great for our community exist out there, a lot of times when it comes down to it, if community, and by community I mean like us, were to make like a consistent push to say, hey, I understand it has to go through these formulas or whatever, but what are we doing to make sure that we are being equitable, which is a huge priority right now at the federal level. What are we doing about that? How can we really make sure that this money is able to do the things that promote racial equity in our projects and how the money gets spent? And if you know words like public engagement, if you know words like task force, if you know words like technical assistance, if you know words like capacity building, like if you just know some of the vocabulary, then it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to direct these dollars. Because when we're thinking about like how things happen, like we talked earlier about like how we've failed in the United States at doing racial equity with these huge investments by purposely excluding people and like being really obvious about it. Nowadays, people are less obvious about it. And it's more about like, you have these like words that you have to know, you have places you need to be, you have things you need to do. And if we don't know those words, if we don't know those places, if we don't know the people, then that's how we're gonna get passed over. So a big part of what panels like this help us do is to have a candid freaking conversation, because you have the opportunity to say, hey, these dollars are gonna come to community one way or the other, but if they don't have our voice, they're not going to go where they need to go, right? So now through panels like this, through trainings, through being able to each one teach one, we're able to really get these dollars from this theoretical idea to like concrete cash in hand.
Okay, Sean, so I got technical assistance, public engagement, task force, capacity building, but I have a question for you. What if for me, infrastructure is childcare?
Yes.
How do I engage with IIJA? Because I feel like maybe the act isn't considering that right now.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But you know what the act is considering right now? It's like, okay, we need union, good paying jobs. Okay, how are we going to do that, right? Who going to watch those babies, right? What businesses are going to be able to support that happening? Childcare. A lot of times, actually, we're going to be doing a training with childcare providers next week, all across the country, talking about how childcare are essential to workforce development. So for those of you who are childcare providers, for those of you who have babies, I have a baby, 8 years, baby. But you know what I mean? Like, you got a childcare in your life. You're a childcare worker, your childcare business. I need all y'all to do this with me. I need us to be thinking about how childcare is essential for anything related to workforce development, which means every time we hear that there are dollars for workforce development, I want us to be thinking those are dollars for childcare. anytime we hear that there needs to be good union, like great paying jobs, I want us to be thinking about, well, one, what might that look like for childcare providers, but also two, what's needed in order to create the conditions for that to happen. So that's where something like technical assistance or capacity building come in. Technical assistance, y'all, you might think it's tech support, like with computers. And you know what? I get you, but like it's actually this other word that means like you get like free experts to help you figure out how to get funding. That means that there are people like me, right, who are out there who take this like hundreds of pages of information and then like talk like regular people about how do you actually get this to turn into real dollars. Funders, you know, government funders, other kinds of funders, they pay people like me to explain this stuff in a way that people can actually get funding. And that's called technical assistance. And capacity building, that phrase I gave you earlier, that's about making sure you have like, still like, it could be experts, it could be dollars, right? It could be like actual cash to help make sure you can do the thing that you need to do. So for you childcare, I do agree. A lot of us are like, you can't have infrastructure without childcare. But guess what? When you read the way that the thing is written, they don't have like, this is childcare, but they do say that they're going to be creating over 2 million jobs a year for the next decade. And how are they going to do that without childcare? Right? So that's one of the things that I really love about investments like this is that it creates an opportunity. But what sucks is it takes like us being able to talk and really advocate and really connect the dots for people so that it's easier for these investments to actually get to where they need to go.
So what you're telling me is if I leverage your buzzwords, capacity building specifically, and get some technical assistance, and while we're doing that workforce development that Toshko was talking about, we can start to weave in childcare as a part of that. Yes, I'm going to take your jump as I got it right.
Yes.
And I love that. I think, you know, like this is where sometimes all these words in an act can become confusing and we miss the opportunity to organize our way into the vision that we want. And I say organize because I don't think that the system's naturally going to respond to our needs. But I do believe that when we organize and we build community power, that we can push systems and investments in that direction. So in that breath, I want to invite each of you to share just like some closing thoughts around community organizing as it relates to IIJA and also the IRA. I'm going to go read about that after this. And can you speak specifically to where community can find information that they need? And what might organizing look like around IIJA? I think it's going to look a lot of ways. So I want to tell folks listening, like, it's not going to be monolithic. And I'm sure each of you are going to bring a unique perspective to that. Joe, I know that you are here and not here, but I'm going to let you audio, you know, give us some thoughts around that.
Yeah, first off, thank you so much for hosting this great conversation. I'm pretty fired up as well in terms of making sure that these investments get to our communities. What I'll bring up, just because I have a district that is urban, but also very rural. And oftentimes the rural communities are the ones that are most left out of this entire process. So for those potentially in rural communities, making sure that you engage either your local elected officials, but also if you want to be proactive with it as well. One of the specific call outs in the IIJA was to ensure that there was a roadmap and a guidebook in terms of how do you actually get this funding out in a better process than we've done historically as well. So especially if you're in a rural area, I want folks hopefully either to engage me or anybody else you might be working with to engage with the community to kind of define kind of what you'd want from a package like this, and then also build a roadmap towards getting that incredibly important. But honestly, I've learned personally so much from this conversation. I wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity to be able to speak, and I'm looking forward to working with folks out in the community for these next 16 years as we get this money out.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for being on with us. And I love that you're lifting up the rural like communities, because some of the workshops that Sean will be doing with us over the next month are specifically going to be to support marginalized communities that are living in rural areas, recognizing that infrastructure, yes, in like our urban areas, our cities is lacking, but it's really lacking in some of our rural areas. And we don't want to miss that in the conversation of the types of investments that are really needed. One thing that I feel like was really exposed during COVID was just the lack of hospitals in many of the rural areas in Washington, and how many people who are in critical need and in critical situations had to try to get to places like Seattle, where the hospitals were really full, to try to get access to healthcare. And if we're just real, our lack of medical infrastructure meant that people died. We lost people. And so really thinking about how is the infrastructure we're building life-giving, promoting life, making sure people are staying alive. So Toshko, what's your advice for community organizers?
Well, this is my last chance to speak, so I just need to take a point of privilege and say I'm completely shook by this panel. It has been such an honor to hear from all of you. I'm about to jump out of my seat because y'all give me so much life. I just want to speak to a little bit about what Senator Nguyen said. He is absolutely right when he talks about intermodal and public transportation. Giving the funding that we know is here, and given the growth of our communities, we know that the public transportation is only going to grow. And we also know the equity impacts that it has in the mobility of our communities, ability to get to school, ability to get to work, ability to get to fresh food, the safety, right? So I wanted to actually lift up for you all a group that goes highly ignored by the public at large, but is really critical. It's called the Puget Sound Regional Council, and it's actually an umbrella council where state legislators and port commissioners and King County council members all come together to decide how federal funding is spent. The
I'm excited for when Commissioner Hasagawa comes back, because I'm ready to learn about the Puget Sound Regional Council, because that sounds like a really important lever for us to know. You're back.
I'm back.
Teach us about the Puget Sound Regional Council.
It's the entity that decides how federal funding is spent on the local level. But it goes highly unaddressed by members and unaware of by the members of the public at large. So I just wanted to flag that one for everybody really quickly, because the way that we're building absolutely matters. I also wanted to address what Sean talked about the role of unions. Okay, unions are the reason why working families have protection against the interests of big corporations who are all about the bottom line. They will cut their workers short in a heartbeat if it means their bottom line, and workers need protection, and that's really important. Unions have that role to make sure that it's that point of entry, so that people from not just communities of color, but also women and non-binary folks who need access to good paying jobs, to make sure they have a quality of life and economic security, particularly in times like these, particularly in places like King County, where livability in city centers becomes less and less and harder. So the unions have a really important role to play. And so I would also encourage folks, who many of you have already considered, instead of going to college, but to get into a skilled trade, show up to those meetings, right? They have a tremendous political capital, and they also have advocacy voice with the way that their employer is actually going to be treating them, right? The terms of their working conditions. And that's so incredibly important. We need to make sure that the way that the contracts are defined, like our goals of percentage of that workforce should be women, non-binary, and POC. And if they're not meeting those goals, there needs to be voice and accountability around that. And Nikita, you are spot on. Childcare is critical infrastructure. We've heard it from Congressman Pramila Jayapal. We're hearing more from our workers on the ground, especially at SeaTac Airport, where they're predominantly women of color who have sustained, and who are immigrants who have sustained that workforce, but are having trouble returning to work because they can't strike that work-life balance. For example, we have a budget process at the Port of Seattle. For the first time, I've introduced a budget proposal to establish a childcare facility for CTAP workers, not Port of Seattle workers with benefits and all the rest, SeaTac airport workers who also live in South King County, where there's a childcare desert. And these are the sorts of things where community members can show up, use their voice, and say, hey, people in a predominantly white male institution, childcare is critical infrastructure, fund it, right? The common theme that you're hearing from all of this, whether it's from the PSRC or unions or childcare and budget proposals at your local jurisdiction, is advocacy. It is so important. You can show up to places and provide public testimony, but you know what? You speak louder when you speak in unison with others. So my recommendation for community members as individuals is to also, in addition to organizing yourselves, use yourself, join the board of a community-based organization that is lending its voice formally towards these decision-making processes. Join boards, official boards and committees at the city, at the state, at the port. For example, at the port, we have the Port Community Action Team. It formalizes your input. We listen to that. And it speaks so much louder than one voice. So stay organized, stay engaged. There's no shortage of ways to be able to plug in. Your time is precious. Hold folks accountable. There's tremendous opportunity and tremendous need.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Hasagawa. One thing I really want to highlight there, a few things actually, is like, I wasn't even thinking about the Puget Sound Regional Council. And I know that these are things that Sean is thinking about. And so when we do these community workshops, you should come through, because they're going to be pointing out areas where there are levers that we can pull, where you can do what Toshko was just talking about around making public comments, submitting thoughts. I mean, some of these things you can do on the internet or over your phone. And I want to emphasize the importance of being in an organizing body, whether that's a grassroots group, a board, a union, whatever is your organizing body where people care about the same issues you care about. There is a lot of power in bringing our individual voices into a collective voice. And if there isn't anything in your area, like in my region where I'm at now in the Midwest, I had asked, who are the folks doing restorative justice, domestic violence organizing? And one of the people in my meeting said, there's not a lot right now. And I was like, oh, sounds like there's something for me to be organizing around and finding other people who want to organize around that. So if something doesn't exist in your area, I guarantee you there are other people, whether it's your apartment building or on your block or in your school, who also are feeling that same struggle. You might just need to have a conversation about it. As y'all are passing by mailboxes or walking through your neighborhood, if people still walk through their neighborhood, strongly encouraged. Walking is good. Moving is good. Multimodal transportation is good. As you can see, I'm really into the infrastructure bug right now. While we're at it, let's add some curb cutouts so that all of our neighbors can move around. Sean, please stop me before I go on a tirade about how inaccessible so many cities are.
Hey, I will never stop that.
What would you say? What else are you saying to folks who need or want to organize around this?
Sure. So, hello, organizers. This is just for you. What was just shared about the Puget Sound Regional Council? For those of you outside of Puget Sound, you're like, hey, I am nowhere near Washington. I need to figure out what to do. I'm gonna tell you exactly what to do. Y'all need to know about a couple of key things. One, the federal government requires there to be these things called, this is the key word. You got your keyword, It requires something that's called a comprehensive economic development strategy. And councils like what we just heard about, they are part of crafting those, which means if you went into Google and you put a quotation mark, comprehensive space economic, space development, space strategy, quotation mark, and your city or county name, you would find very likely which one is yours and look at the most recent one. But what the good news is also is that there are resources that y'all could see that can tap in to find these. One is if you go to eda.gov/resources, you'll see a wealth of information. The reason why I mentioned the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, which you can find at this link, eda.gov/resources, is it tells you the data that people care about, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats as it relates to the economy, and where those federal investments should be directed for your area. I am telling you, as an organizer, that you do not have to start from scratch. You can find out who are the decision makers, right? Who are those people on the council that help decide what the priorities are for the next several years? And right now, literally right now, all the areas all across the country are meeting and talking and figuring out what to do with their comprehensive economic development strategy. And a lot of times the people you're going to see listed on that thing are going to be council of government, all these different things you're hearing, like regional councils, task forces, public engagement groups, advisories, all that stuff is listed in one document, which means that if I was an organizer, I don't have a lot of time, I already got a lot of things I'm passionate about. Now I know one resource that is going to be really helpful for me as I'm directing these dollars. And while I'm thinking about it, y'all might, if you're beginning, think I need to have 20 people, 30 people, whatever, to make a difference. That's not true. What I have noticed is a lot of times you only need about 5, you and 4 other people, to make a really huge difference. And so if you can think of 5 people who also care about creating the things that we talked about, you also care about childcare, you also care about healthcare, you also care about transit, right? You care about anything in your community. If you can find 4 other people who care too, you can have a huge impact, because the people who sit and make that blueprint, we're not talking about a lot of people. Oftentimes it's just a handful of people here and there who are able to shift all of those dollars and the directions that they've decided, because of their experience, need to go. And the last thing I'll say is this, and I'm a little selfish about this, but I think this is really important for you organizers. So many of these dollars are going to go through research. And a lot of times organizers don't realize that a lot of the skills you have are the same skill set to be a really good researcher. So to the extent that you can talk to people about what's important to them, that you can take what they say and make recommendations, you might find that you're someone that can bring that lens to what happens to these dollars. And those research dollars, those often come first before the really big dollars. Those research dollars often set what those funding priorities are. So if I was an organizer, I would be thinking about how can I use community rooted, right, research with my community, where we highlight our expertise and what we know, and we really put forth what needs to happen next. So those are the main things I would say for you organizers. Know that there are documents that people have already spent a lot of time creating and putting in one place for you to take action. Round up 4 or so other people, more if you can, but 4 is good. And then really think about how you can have a strategy that centers community expertise in setting those eligibility.
Wow, I cannot wait till these workshops. I'm so ready. I'm going to learn so much more. I'm going to go from a good organizer to a great organizer under Sean's tutelage. Kirsten, I feel like you brought such a key historical element to this conversation and really highlighting how things have gone in the past. And, you're also an incredible organizer, deeply plugged into community. What are you saying to the folks around you about how we're organizing around IIJA or even other federal spending? Because ARPA is still a very real thing.
Yes.
And there's still implementation happening.
Yes.
What are your words of advice?
My biggest words of advice for folks right now is stay clear on your values. I know where my values are. My values are not ahistorical. They're deeply steeped in our history, which means I know what it looks like when government has spent my dollars before. And I'm not going to forget those lessons, because those lessons tell me how to fortify my organizing now. So a few things is, I know my values are around healing. So when I ask, where's the healing going to be? I have to go to those who have endured the most pain for the longest. So I know that's the most impoverished communities. I know those are the communities that had the least during the pandemic. I know those are the communities who have asked the most and been told no more than their fair share. And let me tell you something, listen to what Sean said, because government will use data or lack of data to say no. So this is an opportunity for us to make sure every bit of data is our community's yes. So those places where you can tell your stories, let me be clear. I'm going to tell you a secret. Hiking just means walking outside. Organizing just means talking to people you probably already want to talk to, who need to have your story to understand why they need to take action. That's all organizing is. Talking and sharing your story so folks know how and when to take action. If you can do that and pace yourself and stay focused, this is not a short thing, y'all. Everything we're talking about, this is 15 years of meetings. This is 15 years of decision making. This is 15 years of a decision being made in a committee, and then 5 years later, the dollars are out, and then 5 years later, something's being built somewhere. So this is a long game. Pace yourself. That's why you're looking for your political home and your allies. But let me also be clear, because this is coming from the federal government, the highest level of government, it's going to show up in every level of government, which means it's showing up in your backyard. So for those who are in the Seattle King County area, I'm going to tell you the cheat sheet places to start looking for your money. You paid the government this money. Now you are going to get back your money to invest directly into your community. You hear what I'm saying? So at the state level, almost every penny that's going to go directly to community are out in grants. Or what grants mean? Grants aren't secret sauce either. All grants mean is someone writes you a check and you don't have to write it back to them. That's the only thing that makes a grant different from a loan. It's money for you to invest in the things that are important, but you don't have to pay it back. And when you get your money back from the government, that's usually a grant. So at the state level, all of that goes through the Department of Commerce. So I'm going to need everyone here to write down www.commerce.wa.gov. And there is literally a page there 24/7 just called Grants and Loans. And every bit of federal dollars or state dollars that the legislature has decided we're investing, the governor funds it through this department under the governor, and make sure that you all know what the grant criteria is and how to get those dollars. For those of us in Seattle King County area, at the King County level, whoever your King County council member is, for me where I am in South Seattle, it's Germay Zehalai. So when I go to his page as my representative who represents me on that council, every one of those council members has a button on their personal page where you get to meet your legislator at the King County level that also has a tab for every King County grant and loan that's available to you, your dollars coming back to you. And then if you're in the city of Seattle, there is also a landing page, seattle.gov/grants-and-funding, which lists at any given time about 150 to 200 funding opportunities for you. I say this because these are URLs that you can look at 2 a.m. if you want to. You can sit in your kitchen organizing with your auntie and your neighbors. You can make sure that you're looking at the places where we make clear what those dollars are available to you. And then working with shops like Sean's shop, other nonprofits, other political homes that know the buzzwords, that have done these applications. They know the person to call at the state level when a form isn't working the way it's supposed to online. Find those folks, because we're going to start organizing together. Because I'm telling you, we're not going to have the same story for our children that our ancestors had for us. We are not going to let these dollars pass us by and be complacent. We're going to make sure that we are heard and that these dollars come back to our communities, because we need to invest in our healing. So I'm really excited to be organizing with you all over the next decade or more to make sure that happens with these dollars.
I knew you would bring us into the home front on this one. So thank you for really like giving us a message. Thank you for dropping those links. Y'all, there is a lot to access, and I don't want to pretend like it's easy. So I want to throw in that one of them words back at you that Sean gave us, which was technical assistance. Most of these grants on those pages that Kirsten just named, they do have some technical assistance. They have workshops where you can learn how to do them, and folks who can support you in figuring out how to fill out the application. And please join us. We're going to be doing 3 workshops over the next month. We're going to do them regionally, so they will be at different times. There'll be a flyer coming out for them soon. The first one will be August 27th, and we're really excited to create an environment where people can talk with each other about organizing. Like Kirsten said, just talking with each other, figuring out what we want to collectively do. I am deeply grateful to each of you for joining us for this Infrastructure for the People conversation, for helping illuminate what the Infrastructure Investments and Job Act is, for bringing to the forefront the Inflation Reduction Act, and for sharing your wisdom as people who are supporting our communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, queer and trans communities, disabled communities, people who need access to childcare, workers, being able to figure out how these federal investments, our money, I'm gonna say it again, our money is being invested. So deeply grateful to everyone who joined us. This live stream will be downloaded and put on the website for this federal spending organizing website that's being created. It will have documents, it'll have recommendations, it will have planning documents and PowerPoints for you to figure out how to organize at your kitchen table with your auntie and your grandma, because we believe that having access to the tools and the information is very powerful. There will also be some music videos being put out by Rel Be Free, poetry by Ebo Barton, art by Jay Reichel, so that if you want to turn this into a campaign in your community, you will have all the assets necessary to do that. So thank you again. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Saturday wherever you may be, and let's get out there and get these investments for our communities. Bye, everyone.